As I reflect on the choices I made in my life, I can't help but feel the weight of regret pressing down on me. It all began with laughter and dancing at our engagement party, surrounded by family and friends, my fiancé Matthew by my side. In those moments, I was convinced he was my soulmate, the man I would spend the rest of my life with. We were desperately in love, dreaming of a future together that included a borrowed house, a romantic wedding ceremony, and the pitter-patter of little feet. It all seemed so simple back then, in the naivety of my 19-year-old self. I was smugly confident, thinking I had it all, the girl who had everything. 20 years later, here I am at 42, living a life filled with the trappings of success, a high-flying career, financial security, and a home in the heart of London's trendy Notting Hill. But despite all this, I find myself childless and alone, tormented by the fact that I walked away from the only true chance of happiness I ever had. In 1989, 8 years after that wonderful engagement party, I made a choice. I walked away from Matthew, convinced that a better, more exciting, and more fulfilling life awaited me. Yet here I am, facing the harsh reality that I never found that elusive Mr. Perfect around the corner. Now, as I look at friends with their families, the pain of my decision haunts me. I remember the discussions Matthew and I had about having children, even choosing names together. It's a bitter pill to swallow knowing that I may never have a family of my own. My father warned me not to throw away the love I had with Matthew, but I was sure I could find something better. The irony is not lost on me. I had the chance and I let it slip away. Now, I find myself grappling with the consequences, surrounded by success, but missing the one thing I crave the most, a loving husband and family. It's painful to admit that I turned my back on so much happiness, trading it for a journey back into the singles market. It's a stark realization that hits me now, with barely a backward glance to the life I left behind all those years ago. It's a story that happens all too often, a tale of regret that echoes in the hearts of those who let go of something precious. As I navigate the world of dating once again, I can't help but hear snippets of information about Matthew's life. 15 years after our relationship ended, he's happily married. Good for him, genuinely. But as I read through this article, I'm confronted with the realization that I might have sabotaged my chance at true happiness by selfishly pursuing something I thought was better. At this time of year, when many are reflecting on their lives and relationships, I see the danger in mistaken contentment for boredom. It's a warning for those considering walking away from the riches they have. I wish I had heeded that warning years ago. Looking back, I remember the painful moment when Matthew pleaded with me not to leave him in 1987. Tears streamed down both our faces, and it tore me apart to witness the heartbreak in the man I loved. But I was resolute, thinking that crying in front of him would only make things more complicated. It's a common mistake, assuming that one can put a relationship on ice and return to it when the grass isn't as green as expected. I recall telling Matthew that one day I might look back and realize I made the biggest mistake of my life. His promise to always be there for me felt like a safety net, one I arrogantly believed I could put on hold while I explored other options. Now, I understand the gravity of my decisions. No one is perfect, and we all make mistakes. But the lesson here is clear. Walking away without looking back is often the best path. I failed to see that, and now I grapple with the consequences of my actions, wondering how different my life might be if I had listened to Matthew's plea all those years ago. Matthew and I shared the same comprehensive school experience in Essex, England. Our story began in 1987, just before Christmas, when I was 17 and in the midst of studying for my A-levels. Matthew had already left school and was working as a motorcycle courier. Despite our different paths, we hit it off from the start and our family supported our relationship. Our love blossomed quickly, fueled by Matthew's romantic gestures and practical nature, which, ironically, would later become a source of irritation for me. I remember the Christmas gifts he gave me, a leather jacket and a pair of thermal leggings. 2 weeks into our relationship, in a rather unconventional move, he proposed in the middle of traffic while we were in my little mini club. He shouted for me to stop the car, and as we stood in the road, he declared his love and asked me to promise that I'd marry him one day. It was like a scene from a cheesy movie, but I laughed and said yes, thrilled that our feelings were mutual. In the summer of 1989, during a romantic meal, Matthew officially proposed with a diamond solitaire ring. The engagement was celebrated with a party for 40 friends and family at the little house we were renting at the time. The following year, we took the plunge and bought a tiny starter home in Grays, Essex, filling it with furniture we had gathered through various means. Our early days were marked by excitement about our grown-up life. I was in my first junior role at a women's magazine, and Matthew worked fitting tires and exhausts. Although our combined salary struggled to reach £15,000 a year, we brushed off the financial challenges, convincing ourselves that it wouldn't be long before we could afford more and start a family. However, life took an unexpected turn when the housing market crashed. Plunged into negative equity, we faced financial difficulties that, initially, brought us closer. Yet, as time passed and my magazine career flourished with a growing salary, resentment started to creep into our relationship. Matthew moved from one dead-end job to another, and the disparity in our professional trajectories became a source of tension. The struggles that should have united us began to drive a wedge between us. I found myself at a crossroads where love and practicalities clashed. Despite my continued love for Matthew, I started feeling embarrassed by his blue-collar jobs. His intelligence was evident, but the lack of a conventional career began to gnaw at me. Even the choice of a lurid blue and pink VW Beetle bothered me. Looking back, these things seem incredibly insignificant, but at the time, they became sources of irritation. It's disheartening to admit that I allowed societal expectations and material desires to cloud my judgment. Matthew had treated me like gold, providing everything a woman could want. When I was content and our relationship was blossoming, his career or the type of car he drove didn't matter. Yet, as my career took off, I found myself wishing for someone more sophisticated, someone with a higher status. Envy crept in as I compared our situation to friends and their better-off partners who could easily support their families. Suddenly, the financial disparity that had once been inconsequential became a significant source of stress. I longed for a life where my partner's income could afford us the luxury of starting a family without financial constraints. In essence, I allowed external pressures and societal expectations to taint the love I felt for Matthew. I failed to appreciate the person he was and the happiness we shared, letting material aspirations and status overshadow the true essence of our relationship. It's a regrettable realization, one that speaks to the corrosive nature of misplaced priorities and the consequences of letting societal norms dictate personal happiness. It's painful to admit that my perception of Matthew underwent a significant transformation. I no longer saw him as my equal, failing to recognize the qualities that had initially made me fall in love with him: his fierce intelligence, our shared sense of humor, and his determination not to conform to societal expectations. Instead of appreciating these qualities, I allowed resentment to build up, viewing him as someone who was holding me back. The turning point came when Matthew's focus shifted to a career opportunity with the police in 1995. While this should have marked a new chapter in our lives, it only hastened the deterioration of our relationship. Matthew's commitment to his new career meant we spent less time together. He worked round-the-clock shifts and long hours on the launch of a new magazine. Despite the positive step forward in his professional life, I failed to appreciate the effort he was putting in. I couldn't see beyond the dwindling sex life and rare nights out, and I took for granted the little gestures he used to make, like leaving romantic notes on the pillow or searching secondhand bookshops for novels he knew I would love. He was not just a partner, but also my best friend. After weeks of festering resentment, I made the painful decision to leave. We spent hours talking and crying as Matthew tried to convince me to stay, but I remained adamant. Even though he had finally found something respectable, working as a police officer, I couldn't see beyond my own grievances. My parents, horrified by my decision, couldn't understand why I was walking away from a man they believed was right for me. My father's words on that day still haunt me, serving as a constant reminder of the gravity of my choice and the potential consequences of taking someone like Matthew for granted. After making the move to a rented flat a few miles away from Horton Church in Essex, I embraced the single life with gusto. At this point, I had risen to the position of an editor on a national magazine, and my days were filled with premieres, dinner parties, and a whirlwind of social events. Surprisingly, Matthew and I remained close despite the breakup. We shared details about our new relationships, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that the women he met weren't good enough for him. Looking back, I recognized the jealousy that fueled those sentiments. It was a selfish desire to keep him for myself, even though I was the one who had ended our relationship. Our closeness faced a sudden halt in 2000 when Matthew met his first serious girlfriend after me, Sarah. Here's where things take a turn, and you'll see the selfish, sabotaging nature of my actions. Matthew, being a good guy, was trying to move on, but I couldn't let go. One night, shortly after his 34th birthday, I called him seeking advice about something. The intent was clear. I wanted to maintain contact, to keep him tethered to me. It's evident now that I was struggling to accept that he could move on without me. However, Matthew, sensing the underlying motive, was unusually abrupt. He asked me not to call him again, drawing a clear boundary between us. This incident marked a turning point, a realization that I needed to respect his boundaries and allow him to build a life separate from mine. Yet, the selfish desire to keep him within reach lingered, setting the stage for a tumultuous journey of self-discovery and the consequences of actions driven by envy and possessiveness. I couldn't stand the fact that Matthew seemed to be putting another woman before me. The audacity of this new woman to come between us was infuriating. Matthew had treated me well, he loved me, and he was making efforts to improve himself. Yet, in my eyes, he still wasn't good enough. I was moving on, but the idea of him doing the same felt like a personal affront. It's hard to admit, but I was unbelievably selfish. Over the next few weeks, my frustration and jealousy boiled over, and I shamefully vented my spleen at both of them in a series of heated phone calls. Looking back, I see that I was completely irrational. I didn't want Matthew back, but I felt unjustly upstaged by Sarah. One particularly nasty argument proved to be the breaking point. Matthew put the phone down and refused to take any more of my calls. At that moment, I didn't realize the finality of it, but little did I know I would never speak to him again. The consequences of my actions became painfully clear, highlighting the destructive nature of jealousy and possessiveness in the aftermath of a breakup. Shortly after parting ways with Matthew, I met Richard, and our romance became a whirlwind. Within a year, we were engaged and purchased an idyllic farmhouse in the Norfolk countryside. I continued my journalistic career, commuting to London, while Richard, a successful singer, toured the country. It seemed like I had found the excitement and love that I craved. Richard's success as a rock star added a thrilling element to my life. However, despite the new chapter, thoughts of Matthew lingered in the background. Richard began to express his discontent, noting that I often brought Matthew into our conversations, even drawing comparisons between them. The past, it seemed, had not entirely released its hold on me, And the ghosts of my previous relationship continued to haunt the edges of my newfound happiness. The struggle to fully let go and embrace the present became evident as my past and present collided in unexpected ways. In the aftermath of my whirlwind romance with Richard, the differences between us became apparent. Despite the outward romance, he repeatedly proved unfaithful, eroding the security I needed to consider starting a family. Eventually, after 3.5 tumultuous years together, he walked out, confessing to fathering a child with his latest paramour. My life crumbled in the wake of his departure, and over the next year I grappled to piece myself back together. During this period of soul-searching, I finally grasped the truth of my father's warnings. It became clear that Matthew was the only person who had truly loved and understood me. News of Matthew's split with Sarah reached me through a mutual friend, and it struck a chord. It was a realization that came too late, but I couldn't ignore the depth of my feelings. I penned a letter, apologizing for my past actions, seeking forgiveness, and desperately asking for a second chance. It was a humbling acknowledgement of the mistakes I had made and a sincere plea for an opportunity to make amends. It had been 6 years since we last spoke, and in my naivety, I thought reaching out would be welcomed. What I didn't realize was that Sarah was still a presence in Matthew's life, residing in the same house. It was she who opened my personal letter, which included my phone number, and she left me several angry and hurtful voicemails. I couldn't blame her. Once again, my actions had inadvertently caused problems in Matthew's life. Understanding the unintended consequences, it was unsurprising that I never heard directly from him. Despite my attempts to reconnect through several letters over the next few months, I eventually decided to leave it at birthday and Christmas cards. The hope was that if Matthew ever changed his mind or felt ready to reconnect, he'd find a way to get in touch. It was a recognition of the need to respect boundaries and allow space for healing, even if the desire for reconciliation remained. A couple of years ago, I heard that Matthew had married his new partner, Nicola. In those few moments, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and the tears began to flow. The waterworks are real right now. Matthew and Nicola still live in Essex, and as far as I know, they haven't had children yet. That's the next milestone I truly dread. It's been 11 years since Matthew and I last spoke, and I have to accept that the door is closed. Perhaps he has found what he's looking for, and I am now just a distant memory. I doubt he'll ever forget the crazy chick who made such an imprint on his life. There was one other significant relationship since Richard, with a man named Rob. After 4 years, that recently ended. Rob reminded me a lot of Matthew, decent, honorable, the life of the party, but with a kind and sensitive side. However, we were both too jaded by previous heartaches to make it work. I wanted children, but he had a grown-up son and didn't want to start over again. So once again, I find myself on my own, grappling with the if-onlys. If only I had stayed with Matthew, we'd almost certainly be married with children by now. Or maybe Matthew wasn't the right man. I'll never know the answer, but my decision to leave him has undoubtedly cost me the chance of ever becoming a mother. The weight of that realization is a heavy burden to carry. Looking back, I can only lament the choices of my younger, selfish self. When I visit friends and family back in our hometown, there's a part of me that yearns to bump into Matthew. I imagine saying, "I'm sorry," expressing that I will always be there for him. However, deep down, I wouldn't be surprised if he chose to turn his back on me and kept walking.